I still remember the first time I had a root beer float. It was elementary school. We were having a movie day, and our teacher surprised us by making root beer floats for the whole class. I had no idea what to expect. Ice cream floating in soda sounded weird. Then I took a sip. The root beer was fizzy, the vanilla ice cream was creamy, and somehow it worked perfectly. What I didn't know back then was that I was drinking something that had existed for well over a century. And the story behind it is a lot more interesting than you'd think. Here is the history of the root beer float. But to understand the root beer float, we first need to talk about root beer itself. Long before soda companies existed, people in North America were making herbal drinks using roots, bark, berries, and spices. One of the most common ingredients was sassafras root. Native Americans had used sassafras for centuries, and European settlers eventually began making beverages from it. By the 1800s, homemade root beer recipes were everywhere. Families would brew their own versions using ingredients like sassafras, wintergreen, birch bark, licorice root, vanilla, molasses. Every recipe tasted a little different. It wasn't the bright, sugary root beer we know today. It was more of a homemade herbal drink. Root beers contained no alcohol despite the word beer, which helped make them popular with families and children. Then, during the late 1800s, root beer started becoming commercialized. One of the biggest names was Charles Elmer Hires, a Philadelphia pharmacist who helped turn root beer into a national phenomenon. At the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, Hires introduced his root beer to a massive audience, selling root beer extract that allowed people to make the drink at home. Suddenly, root beer wasn't just something families made in their kitchens, it was becoming one of America's favorite drinks. Now, here's where things get interesting. The most widely accepted story takes us to Cripple Creek in 1893. A man named Frank J. Wisner owned the Cripple Creek Brewing Company. One evening, Wisner looked out towards Cow Mountain. The snow on the mountain reflected the moonlight, creating a contrast of bright white against the dark landscape below. The sight reminded him of vanilla ice cream floating on a glass of root beer. The idea was simple: a scoop of vanilla ice cream dropped into a cold glass of root beer. The result was something completely new. The sweetness of the soda blended with the creamy ice cream, while carbonation rushed around it, creating a thick foam that rose above the rim of the glass. What started as a simple experiment quickly became a local favorite, and similar versions began appearing in soda fountains across the country. Interestingly, it wasn't originally called a root beer float. Wisner supposedly named it the Black Cow. Over time, different regions developed their own names. Some called it a brown cow, some stuck with black cow, others simply called it a root beer float. Even today, the name can change depending on where you're from. The timing couldn't have been better. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, soda fountains were becoming one of the most popular gathering places in America. You could find them inside drugstores, department stores, ice cream parlors, and diners. They weren't just places to grab a drink, they were social hubs where people met, talked, and spent time away from home. As bottled root beer became more widely available, the float spread alongside it. By the 1910s and 1920s, root beer floats could be found in soda fountains across the country. During the Roaring Twenties, soda fountain culture exploded. Teenagers gathered after school, families stopped in during errands, and ice cream treats became a daily part of social life. The float fit perfectly into that world. It was cheap, quick to make, and entertaining to watch. The moment ice cream hit soda, foam surged upward, turning a simple drink into a small spectacle. As American car culture grew, roadside diners and drive ins carried the flow into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Families traveling by car would stop for burgers, fries, and a cold dessert at the end of the meal. By then, it wasn't just a soda fountain novelty anymore. It had become part of American dining culture. Why does it foam so much? There's actually a simple reason. Ice cream contains tiny air pockets. When it hits carbonated root beer, the carbon dioxide in the soda rushes to escape, attaching to those air pockets and forming bubbles. That reaction creates the thick foam that rises rapidly to the top of the glass. It's part science experiment, part dessert, and part of what makes it fun to watch. Throughout the 1900s, the root beer float became one of America's most recognizable desserts. It survived the Great Depression, World War II, the rise of fast food, changing food trends. While countless snacks and drinks disappeared or evolved, the root beer float stayed almost exactly the same. Two ingredients: root beer and vanilla ice cream. No complicated recipe, no special equipment, just a combination that worked so well it never needed to change. What's interesting is that root beer floats have managed to survive generations without really changing. Most foods evolve over time, recipes get updated, ingredients change, brands reinvent themselves. The root beer float didn't. A scoop of vanilla ice cream, a glass of root beer, that's it. Easy nostalgia. Maybe that's why it sticks in people's memories, not because it was rare or special, but because it was simple. It showed up in ordinary places, diners, birthday parties, school events, small town restaurants, and summer nights out, but left behind small details that stayed with people. The sound of the fizz, the foam spilling over the rim, the ice cream slowly disappearing into the soda if you waited too long. Things you didn't think about much at the time, but remember clearly years later. More than 130 years after it was first created, the root beer float is still around. In a world where snacks and drinks constantly change, that's rare. It didn't survive because it was complicated or innovative. It survived because it was simple and because it quietly became part of people's lives. From soda fountains to diners to elementary school movie days, the root beer float has stayed in the background of American food culture for generations. I hope families continue to pass it on to generations. Parents go on to teach their kids how to make one. And if you've ever had one, chances are it's tied to a memory for you as well. Maybe that's the real secret, not the root beer, not the ice cream. The moment it becomes part of your story.